March of 2006, a city dump truck backed into the car owned by Curtis Goki, doing extensive damage. As you might imagine, Curtis Goki sued the city of Lodi, California in the amount of $3,600 for the damage done to his car. The problem was, Curtis Goki was the one driving the city dump truck. He even admitted it was his fault to the accident. As you might imagine, the lawsuit was thrown out of court as it was deemed that Goki could not sue himself. Does this sound like justice to you? Let me share with you another story. This one a little bit closer to home. Dennis Lee Curtis was arrested in Rapid City for armed robbery, but Curtis was not one of your run-of-the-mill robbers. You see, Curtis followed a code that he left in his wallet when he was arrested. Some might call it kind of a robber's code or a robber's rules. And the rules went like this. Number one, I will not kill anyone unless I have to. Number two, I will take cash and food stamps, no checks. You know, there are some businesses that don't take checks. I will rob only at night. I will not wear a mask. Sorry, Batman. I will not rob mini marts or 7-Eleven stores. 6, if I get chased by cops on foot, I will get away. Now, there's confidence. If chased by a vehicle, I will not put the lives of innocent civilians on the line. 7, I will rob only 7 months out of the year. The other 5, I don't know. And 8, I will enjoy robbing from the rich to give to the poor. I'm assuming that Curtis considers himself poor. Unfortunately, his list did not help him in the court case. Dennis Lee Curtis may have followed these robbers' rules, but by the state of South Dakota, they found him guilty and he's now serving prison time. Is this justice? He had a code, but yet he violated the letter of the law of the land. So let's turn to God. Because today and over the next few weeks, we're going to be looking at this question of what does God require of us? Probably one of the most profound and significant questions found in all of the Bible. It comes from the short little book of Micah, specifically chapter 6, verse 8. And since we have it on the screen here, it's also in the front of your bulletin. Let's go ahead and read it together. What does the Lord require of you? To do justice and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. Well, as you might imagine, we're going to be addressing each of these answers over the next few weeks. So today we focus specifically on to do justice. Mike Benishek is a pastor in Oregon. Mike is also a good friend of mine. We went to both college and to seminary together. And in one of his messages, he talks about a story that I think fits very well this passage from Micah. He writes, I remember my mother once asked me to put the clothes from the washer to the dryer before I went to school. I did that. That same day, I also remember being scolded by my mother for not starting the dryer. Some days I'm not that bright, and to be honest, I didn't think about that. In my defense, I told her that she didn't ask me to start it, only to put the clothes in there. My defense didn't work. But it did teach me something about responsibility. Sometimes we are responsible for things beyond the letter of the law. There are some days that I am cursed with the ignorance that I once showed. We were at summer camp and I caught several kids sword fighting with tiki lamps, utterly destroying them. I intervened and asked, what's going on? And the response I got was, you never said we couldn't do this. Several years before that, we had a good old-fashioned pillow fight. 2 cabins getting after each other. Now, in my several decades of leading camps, we've only had to go to the hospital twice. Once was for a broken arm, and then this time. For the pillow fight, one of the kids puts rocks in his pillowcase. He charged for a girl without a pillow, but who was bigger and stronger than he was. He revved up for the swing, but before he could let loose, she grabbed the pillowcase from him and whacked him across his head, completely unaware of the rocks. On the way to the hospital where he would be diagnosed with a concussion, I asked him, what in the world were you thinking? And he replied, When you were going over the rules, rocks and pillowcases were never addressed. I shouldn't say it, but I didn't feel sorry for him one bit with his bump on his head. You know, my friend's recollection reminds me of a conversation I had with a business executive. He knew I was a pastor, and we got into a discussion about justice. Now, his understanding of justice makes a lot of sense to you if you are in the business world. He looked at me and he said, justice is like when I learn someone has been stealing from the company and I do my job gathering evidence so that he can be fired or maybe we need to call the police. And then he looked at me and he said, that's justice, isn't it? We had an interesting discussion that day. And I realized at that point that we were on different wavelengths. We were comparing apples to oranges. Because God's justice, God's sense of justice is not this neat, defined sense of right and wrong, black and white. It's not, here are the rules, you mess up, it's time for justice. Let me share with you this story, what I mean. After moving to a new state, John Bakema went to the Department of Motor Vehicles to get a new driver's license. The guy behind the desk said he couldn't help because the license was suspended. There must be some mistake, John said. I've never done anything to deserve that. The civil servant was very civil, but said he had to clear up the problem with the state of Massachusetts before he could help. John Bakema had not lived in Massachusetts for 10 years, so he couldn't imagine what was wrong. 5 long-distance calls later, he found out that when he moved to Massachusetts, he owed part of an excise tax of $2. That tiny little bill began to accrue penalties and interest. John had to pay that bill plus the cost of a new Massachusetts driver's license and registration for a car that had long ago become scrap metal before he could become legal in his new home state. The price tag for this costly error was nearly $300. The whole thing was embarrassing, said John Bakema. It wasn't so much the money that bothered me, it was knowing that I was on the wrong side of the law for all those years without even being aware of it. Again, the question, is this justice? You mess up, it's kind of the idea, but you mess up, okay, be ready to face the consequences no matter how ridiculous it is. What does the Lord require of us? Really, God is asking something very, very different. Our scripture for today from Micah is really about the laws that Israel has to follow for being the chosen people of God. Micah is a prophet, which means that he does social commentary. When we tend to think of prophets, we tend to think of prophets that can foresee the future, prophesy. Now, I think that if you look at the prophets in the Old Testament, that is part of what they do, but really their main job is to shed godly wisdom on current circumstances, to preach so that God can be found in present conditions. You know, I think we need some modern prophets today. Micah was a prophet around 700 years before Christ. And at this time, by now, Israel had received the law from Moses, right off of Mount Sinai. They had been ruled by kings, both David and Solomon. But after David and Solomon died, they had some kings that were pretty good and some kings that followed their own agenda. But Israel still had laws to follow. In fact, you have a copy in front of you of those laws. If you look right in front of you in the pews, you will see the Bible. The first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, is what is called the Torah. Literally translated, the law. What you find in there is regs, regulations, and rules that every good Israelite should follow. In there you find the 10 Commandments. But in addition to those 10 Commandments, you find hundreds of other laws that are obligations of what we must abide by and follow. Now, at the time of Micah, something happened. For you see, there was a shift in thinking of how they viewed the law. They forgot why they had the laws, and they just put emphasis on the law itself. Now, behind any law really is a fundamental truth in what we believe in. We believe in something, and so it becomes mandated in our laws. We believe killing is wrong, and so we have a law that says you do not kill. We believe in protecting people's property and rights, and so we have a law that does just that. But the people of Micah's day and age forgot what the law represented, and they focused on the law itself, and without the meaning behind it. So, since we're talking about law, what we find here is a court case. In fact, right before this passage in Micah 6:8, we have a court case. God takes Israel to court. It reads like this. The Lord says, "Rise, plead your case before the mountains. Let the hills hear your voice. Hear, you mountains, the controversy of the Lord, and your enduring foundations of the earth, for the Lord has a controversy with his people." Now, just like in court, we have a plaintiff, and that's God, and we have a defendant, which is Israel. And the plaintiff, which is God, is accusing the defendant Israel of not living up to the covenant agreement made at Mount Sinai. Now, here's something to realize. If you are ever going to take God to court, realize that the verdict is already decided before you get to court. You still allows you to argue. You can take God to court, but as we find here, the verdict was already done. And so what comes after the verdict stage is the punishment. Israel says to God, "With what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams and then thousands of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, with the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul?" With this language here, Israel is trying to fulfill its obligation, its law-giving sacrifice, mandated retribution. It is trying to live up to the letter of the law, but God is saying, "No, Israel, you're not quite getting it. The law is there for a reason. You are forgetting the meaning of the law. What does the Lord require of you? To do justice and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God." As I said, we're going to be getting into those other two here in the next couple weeks. So what does it mean to do justice? There was a little boy who broke a glass on a street lamp. Greatly disturbed, he asked his dad, "What shall I do?" "Do," exclaimed his father. "Well, we must report it, and we have to ask what we must pay and go and settle it." This wasn't quite what the boy was hoping for. In fact, he kind of whimpered to his dad, and he says, "I thought all we had to do was just ask God to forgive me." Is this how we're to understand and translate the book of Micah? What does justice look like within our church, within our community, within our nation? Because when we think of laws, we think of obligations. When we think of the law, we think about what we should not do. Almost all of our laws deal with something we should not do. Even the 10 Commandments, many of them start out with, "You shall not, you shall not, you shall not." But God looks on the flip side. God is not interested in what we didn't do, but much more in what we did do. For you see, beyond the obligations, beyond the law, I really think of that as responsibility. Obligations are law mandated. Responsibility is what is morally right. Do you see the difference? If I see a crime on the street, I am under no obligation to do anything. But I have a responsibility to do something. Does that make sense? If I see suffering in my town, I'm under no law to help out, but I am responsible to do what I can. Millions of people are dying across the world, and I have no obligation to send any relief, but I am responsible for what happens in the world. Now, wouldn't that be an interesting thought? If I were held for what is responsible in the world. I mean, we could argue back with God. Okay, God, we had no obligations. We did what we were required to do. And maybe God would answer, yes, you had no obligations, but couldn't you have done something? You might have followed the law, but did you fight for justice? I want to share with you a short little quick clip from the movie Gandhi. It's hard to believe this movie came out 35 years ago. The scene you're about to see takes place right after an act of violence in India. 3 protesters die. And in the following action, these protesters charge after the police, and what happens is 22 police officers, British and Indian officers, die a horrible death. What you see in this clip is a response to that question from God: what does the Lord require of us? Go ahead.
That's one bit of news they haven't censored.
No, it's all over the world. India's non-violence.
What can we do? We must end the campaign.
After what they did at the massacre, it's only an eye for an eye.
An eye for an eye only ends up making the whole world blind.
Gandhi, do you know the sacrifices people have made? Would never get the same commitment again, ever. The whole of India is on the move.
Yes, but in what direction? If we obtain our freedom by murder and bloodshed, I want no part of it. Babu, you are the father of the nation. Today I see no ground in that for anything but shame. It was one incident. Tell that to the families of the policemen who died. But the whole nation is marching. They wouldn't stop even if we asked them to. I will ask, and I will fast as a penance for my part in arousing such emotions, and I will not stop until they stop.
But God, be sure the British won't censor that. They'll put it on every street corner.
Gandhiji, people are aroused. They won't stop. If I die, perhaps they will stop.
What does the Lord require of you? To do justice. I think we can all agree Gandhi was one of a kind. He was truly a man to take the entire nation of India upon his shoulders. He was willing to take on the British Empire with nonviolence, and he was willing to offer himself as an act of repentance for everyone. This is doing justice. And Micah is not alone. He's just one of many prophets that we find in the Bible who remind us not of obligation, but our responsibility as a people of God. We're going to be hearing from the short little book of Haggai.
Be reading from the book of Haggai, chapter 2, verses 1 through 9. On the 21st day of the 7th month of that same year, the Lord spoke again through the prophet Haggai. He told Haggai to speak to Zerubbabel, the governor of Judah, to Joshua, the high priest, and to the people, and to say to them, is there anyone among you who can still remember how splendid the temple used to be? How does it look to you now? It must seem like nothing at all. But now, don't be discouraged, any of you. Do the work, for I am with you. When you came out of Egypt, I promised that I would always be with you. I am still with you, so do not be afraid. Before long, I will shake heaven and earth, land and sea. I will overthrow all the nations, and their treasures will be brought here, and the temple will be filled with wealth. All the silver and gold of the world is mine. The new temple will be more splendid than the old one, and there I will give my people prosperity and peace. The Lord Almighty has spoken.
Thank you, Doug. Haggai is this tiny little book. In fact, if you open it up, it's only got 2 chapters. But talk about hope. It's a quick read, but if you need something to lift your spirits, if you need something to fill you with optimism, if you need to feel good about the future, about what God has in store for you and this nation, then I recommend the book of Haggai. Think about it. With everything that is going on in our nation right now, we need good people like Gandhi and Micah and Jesus and Haggai to remind us of what we need right now. A bit of hope and a biblical sense of justice. Linda and Peter Beale's daughter Amy was murdered in 1993 by an angry political mob in South Africa. She had gone down there to work as a Fulbright scholar. Within hours after what happened to Amy, says Linda Beale, we began receiving faxes and phone calls from people who lived in her township. People she worked with, white people as well as black, thousands of people. And what everyone said was, please, come see, come help. Amy had always shared with her dreams and goals. There was no hesitancy on our part. There was a part of what we felt we had to do. 2 months after her death, we came to South Africa as guests of the township. We were brought into the environment where she was killed, shown the issues of the day. As time went on, people gave money and we set up a foundation. And the Beals began to spend more and more time in the township where Amy had died, trying to understand the roots of the hatred that had killed their daughter. And in 1998, when 2 of her killers received amnesty and were released from prison, they came to work with the Beals. What does the Lord require of you? To do justice. To go beyond obligation and to what is your responsibility as a child of God. This is justice. It is stories like these that gives me hope for the future. Amen. I'm going to ask our ushers now to wait.